and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Madeleine Gupta, an innovator and strategist based out of Berlin, and I'm so honored to partner with the Impact Hub Network to lead this session of Impact State of Mind on behalf of Impact Hub New York Metropolitan Area. Just for a little bit of context for our new joiners, Impact Hub New York Metropolitan Area is a nonprofit supporting entrepreneurs and change makers through programs designed to help impactful ideas succeed. We work across the New York Metro broadly and are part of a global association of entrepreneurial communities in more than 100 cities and across 50 countries. Impact State of Mind particularly is a virtual series created to support innovators and connect the impact community. These sessions are a way for entrepreneurs to connect digitally and internationally on topics that are at the forefront of social impact today. We are so excited and honored to have Madeleine Livingston online with us today. This is a super special session because Madeleine is a dear friend. We met about 6 to 7 years ago when we were working together at Citibank, and I have gotten to know Maddie and her work in these past years, and I'm so excited that she's here to share all her work and learnings with us today. Maddie is a recent graduate of the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth, where she focused her studies on the business of healthcare. She is passionate about democratizing access to excellent healthcare and the intersection of technology and personalized care. Madeleine has experience working in management and strategic roles at various healthcare startups, including Parsley Health, Motherhood, Flux Biosciences, and The Well. Before pursuing her MBA, Maddie was working at Citibank, where she managed the global banking and insurance needs of asset management clients. She is an experienced board leader with over 5 years of experience working with the community maternal and children's health agency. She most recently held the co-chair position of LSA Family Health Services Junior Board, and she will share more about this with us today, where she led fundraising efforts and managed the junior board's finances. So without further delay, thank you so much, Maddie, for joining us today. So such an honor and privilege to have you online with us. So let's kick this off. We would love to hear a little bit more about your work dedicated to healthcare. Tell us about LSA, the vision, and the overall goals as they relate to the SDGs.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, so exciting to be here with you, Matali, after getting to work together. And I think I'll take your question backwards and I'll talk about the SDGs first, because I actually started working on the SDGs even before my time at Citi, but they were known as, I think, the post-2015 development agenda at that time. But while I was at Citi, I had the opportunity to kind of build out employee engagement events around all the work that Citi was doing as a massive global organization around gender equity work. And so that's really where my work with the SDGs begins. But as you mentioned, I spent a lot of time working with LSA Family Health Service as head of the junior board and also as a volunteer. And so that's really where my work in healthcare began. And that was also about 7 years ago. So just to give a bit of background on LSA Family Health Service, they are a community health agency based in East Harlem. They were started in 1891, and I describe them as really a mini city block health for those of you that are familiar with city block health. And I'm seeing a hi from Farjana Roman, who also worked with us at Citi. And so LSA Family Health Service really focuses on the social determinants of health. And so I would describe their work as both timely and timeless, in that very timely in terms of the fact that they were delivering care in a population that was impacted severely by COVID-19, but timeless in that they're extremely focused on affirming the dignity of families and care delivered directly into the community. So that's a bit of background on LSA and their vision.
That sounds great. And maybe you can dive into and give us a little bit more about certain projects that you're working on that would be helpful for our participants to know.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight that LSA has really focused on over the past couple of years, it's really that they serve directly the needs that are known as the social determinants of health. So you can think of these as all the different factors in a person's life that impact healthcare. So the first thing that comes to mind is really food security. So during the the height of the pandemic, LSA was serving about 800 families a day out of their food pantry. And they're also extremely involved in children's health research around the linkages between environmental health and things like obesity and childhood asthma. They also have a robust home visiting program that supports prenatal and postpartum care in East Harlem. So those are, a bit more information about the background and some of the services that LSA carries out. And then in terms of some of my other work, so as you mentioned, I've been involved in various startups. So I've been involved in a group-based care startup called June Motherhood, as well as another women's health startup called Flux Biosciences. And so some of the opportunities that I've really had to, think about in the, both of the capacity of those roles are how do we redesign care delivery to meet the needs and the health of women and children. So that's what I've been most, recently focused on.
That sounds great. And just going off of what you had mentioned, you had said that your work with the SDGs in healthcare began back in 2012 when, you were not directly working in this space. So tell us a little bit about what led you to this work. Why are you passionate about it? And what brought you here where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Sustainable Development Goals, really the common thread there between my work back in 2012 to 2021 is really gender equity and the status of women in a community. I believe fundamentally that the health of women generally a barometer for the health of the community. And so starting in 2012, I was really focused on gender equity when it came to education systems. So I presented a paper to the UN on how to think about gender equity in education systems in post-conflict states. And then I also did a lot of research around financial inclusion and gender equity over my time kind of throughout undergrad. And then actually that was really the nature of some of the work at Citi. So it was not only gender equity at Citi in terms of our internal organization, but also, the various initiatives that we had on financial inclusion. And then most recently, I've been much more focused on, the status of women as relates to women's health. And I think the way that we treat health, at the very beginning of life, the pediatric health, all the way to the full life cycle of women's health and women's hormonal health really says a lot about the way that we value women in a community.
Mm-hmm. That sounds great. And I think it would be interesting to hear, especially being in finance together and seeing that kind of world. Finance isn't necessarily a gender equal space. It is more a male dominated space. How did you kind of, take that in your time there? And how does that relate to some of the gender equity and the financial inclusion work that you were doing?
Yeah, I think one big commonality that I sense, between those two areas, really this idea of advocacy and the importance of advocacy. So in a male dominated space, it's important to become, your own advocate in terms of what you're capable of and what type of jobs you want to seek out and the type of space that you need to create, a life that you want. And I think we see something very similar in terms of healthcare. So oftentimes when I talk about advocacy, I'm really talking about situations where there's information asymmetry. So where one person seems to have more power or more information than another person. And so that would be, a major piece of advice that I would give, in the women's health space are really seek out ways for you to become an advocate for your health so that you feel that you're on, the same playing field when you're in a healthcare setting and the health of others. I think that's, that's really critical. And that's definitely a common sense that I would describe between those two environments. But I would also say, you need to be able to see in your organization what you could eventually become. And so that also is tied into the healthcare system as well. And so one area that I'm really interested in right now that definitely has kind of kept me passionate is really this concept of community health workers or lay health workers. And I think in healthcare, in addition to finance, we have a diversity challenge. We have the majority of providers, are not super diverse. And that is, really, really important in the care delivery system. It's really important to building trust with patients that they have providers that either look like them or, very acutely understand their needs. And so for me, I'm interested in supporting, new ideas, new innovations that support cultural congruence in care delivery so that people can, build trust and feel like they have a relationship with diversity and kind of unique understanding at its core.
Yeah, and that sounds incredible. And clearly one of the unique challenges that healthcare organizations are facing, this entire thing around culture and community and connection. What would you say are some of the other unique challenges that you have come across, whether that's through LSA or other healthcare organizations that you have worked with, that they are facing? And then how are they overcoming those? What are some of the solutions?
Yeah, I mean, anyone in healthcare will tell you that healthcare is endlessly interesting because there are seemingly endless challenges or opportunities if you're an optimist. So that, what we just spoke about in terms of cultural congruence, that is definitely a key challenge. And we see that playing out now with things like vaccine hesitancy. I mean, you can't build trust with a community in a crisis. You have to build trust over years and actions and rectifying situations when you make mistakes. So I'll put that out there. But I think back to my favorite topic of community health workers, we see shortages of community health workers in half of US states. And this shows up in areas like addiction counseling and behavioral health, where we need more people to be involved in this space. And, maybe you have a day job where you're a banker or you're a strategist, but, at night or on your weekends, you work as a peer mental health counselor, or you work as a doula or lactation counselor. That not only, supports a healthcare system that's fragile, but it also enables diversity within the healthcare system. So that's sort of a challenge with a potential solution attached to it. I would also say that in this area of the social determinants of health, which we talked about at the beginning because of all LSA's incredible work, we know that food insecurity results in negative impacts on someone's health. But we've been slow to see investments in those spaces because it takes several years to bear that out and to really see what these investments will ultimately do. The data is very early there. So I would encourage people to make those investments and stay the course. I think we see the impact of things like food insecurity and having, financial stability over the course of someone's life, even if the ROI is not, immediate within the year range that investors are looking for.
And can you talk to us a little bit more about, just taking a little bit of a shift, other projects in relation to healthcare and healthcare investing you're working on? So when we talked earlier, you mentioned mentorship, a blog that you're starting, a podcast potentially. Would love to hear about so many different areas that you're dabbling into, and how do they all kind of interconnect?
Sure. So I'll start with the mentorship side. I just made a post on LinkedIn recently, and I think we can probably share it in the chat at some point. But I love talking to future entrepreneurs, current entrepreneurs, people who want to know what entrepreneurship is, about what you're thinking about building. I find that I had a really good mentor who told me, always seek to make a playbook for other people. The things that you found challenging, you should try to make easier for other people. And I would say, when I was initially exploring, healthcare investing and healthcare, innovation, I just had so many questions. So I would love to hear from you. I would love to set up time with you. We can chat. We can kind of run through ideas together. We can brainstorm, and I'm happy to share some of the bits of knowledge that I've picked up over time. But I often learn more from you in those conversations than you'll learn from me. So my calendar is, open to anyone who wants to talk. So that will definitely be part of what I'm working on. I also have a blog. I call it my erstwhile blog because it needs to become more active. But one of the next articles that I'll be writing is on community health workers. As you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about this topic. So you can wait for that to come out. My blog is called The Healthcare Hereafter. And I have a bunch of other content on there about femtech, or the areas of women's health, in addition to pediatric and family health, for you to take a look at, in addition to some overviews of my time at the Tuck Social Venture Fund, where I just spent about 1.5 years as an impact investor. And then I hope to have a forthcoming podcast. I have 2 really good friends from business school, one of whom is a doctor now. He's a resident in internal medicine, and then another is an investor. And so we hope to kind of talk about all the latest healthcare activity from the various front lines of innovation that we're on, from the hospital to kind of like the startup innovation ecosystem. So those are a couple projects I have.
Wow, you're managing so much. Do you have any tips on kind of how are you doing so many different things? We've actually had a couple, entrepreneurs and just also full-time people reaching out to us and asking us, how do you manage to handle so many side projects with a full-time job, for example, or have just dabble in different things and pursue your hobbies? What is kind of like your little tip on how you can get all of this going?
I'm laughing because I think it takes a while to figure out what works for you, but I would say like the number one thing that makes it easier is just love this work. I feel like I'm on the right path. It's mission oriented, it's challenging. So I make time for things that I love. And so when it comes down to it, I'm always willing to move things around to make sure that, I'm achieving the goals that I want. This work is just so critical. And I feel like it's really the work of our generation to figure out how to improve care delivery. So I definitely attach like a strong mission to what I work on, which helps. But I would also say I'm pretty diligent about my calendar, and I make sure that I am scheduling, when I'm supposed to be working on things, but also scheduling time to sort of reflect as well. I think that people that have a reflective practice are often able to cut out things that maybe are not serving them. So I would recommend that to people, to be, kind of ruthless when you look at your week and how you are spending your time and what's really kind of benefiting you and your mission and your goals.
That's some great tips. I hope it was helpful for our attendees. Coming back to a little bit of the LSA work, can you maybe talk to us about just how did the organization manage COVID, and what were some of the relief efforts there? How did they integrate that with already their ongoing work in the healthcare space? Just to make sure that they're giving priority to both the normal issues as well as COVID. Obviously, the pandemic put a lot of stress in different areas. How was that managed? Can you talk to us about some of the work? Can you talk to us about some of the initiatives? Yeah.
COVID was a watershed / inflection point for LSA in many ways. I think that for so long, they have been, since 1891, as I mentioned, over 100 years, they've been serving the East Harlem community, and they've been focused on all of the social factors of an individual's health that contribute to medical expenses. And so in many ways, COVID was like, there was finally this realization that these explicitly health-related factors play a huge role in how people are able to live their lives. So I think in many ways, it was like, we finally had outside recognition that this work is critically important. And in my own sort of ecosystem of healthcare investors, that thought was also there in terms of, we've been investing in value-based care for ages. And now people are finally realizing that this is, really how healthcare should be delivered. We should look at all of the social factors of a person's life in addition to the medical factors. And in terms of how they changed operations, so very boots on the ground, like they, immediately to their staff deployed, computers, laptops, making sure people could do their work from home. And in terms of the individuals that were running sort of like parent and child development sessions, and all of those were moved over to Zoom. But in terms of the nursing and the home care teams, they were still going out throughout COVID, taking care of, the elderly who couldn't leave their home, and taking care of pregnant women and women that were recently postpartum and their children. I think this session is called, Meet the Innovator, but in my opinion, the real innovators are the people that were delivering care throughout COVID. We're going into homes, we're going into the hospital. Those are the people who are really on the front lines, and we're doing that day in and day out. So thank you to anyone on this call that worked in that field, and thank you generally, because those are the people that really kind of bore the brunt of the reality of COVID. And I would say, in terms of the future of LSA, I think that there was a record fundraising year in terms of people realizing the importance of their work, but now it's, we have to keep up that momentum. And now that we have this shared language of the social determinants of health, and we know we need to focus on that, we know how that contributed to the vulnerability of the community, we have, additional wind beneath our wings kind of going forward to support the community. But I, of course, welcome the help of anyone who is interested. And so we have a junior board, which consists of members under 40 who are interested in supporting the community health agency. And we also accept things like in-kind donations as well, to support kind of the needs of the pediatric program, but then also the home visiting program.
That sounds great. And just pivoting off that, you mentioned some of the ways to get involved with LSA. Are there any other, either fellowship programs or any other mentoring programs or initiatives, or just other pathways people could take to get more involved with the kind of work you're doing or related to this, to basically pursue their passion more?
Yeah, I would encourage everyone to take an interest in the health of their community. I think one of the best ways for you to understand the fault lines of a community that you're living in is to really integrate yourself into the healthcare system. So beyond, working with an organization like LSA, which you should absolutely do. I think if you're interested in really thinking about the health of your community, there are a number of ways for you to get involved as sort of a lay healthcare worker. That was something that I did during COVID, which was really, really powerful. So I spent most of COVID working as a patient support volunteer at a local hospital up in Hanover when I was at business school. Essentially, there were visitor restrictions on the hospital, so patients could not have family coming in to see them when they were in the ICU or kind of, throughout the inpatient units. And so I spent a lot of my time actually helping patients see their family members on Zoom. Because we know that psychosocial support is really, really critical to healing. And most hospitals will have volunteer programs around patient experience. So I would definitely recommend people take a look at those. And there are other ways to get involved in the healthcare ecosystem as well, becoming a doula, becoming a lactation counselor, doing something like a peer mental health counseling. All of these programs exist. And I would encourage people to really take an interest in the health of their communities.
Thank you for sharing all those tips with us. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about, you mentioned that you're passionate about providing access to healthcare through technology and different ways we can harness technology to do this. Maybe you can give us some examples of how do you see this happening outside of, for example, you just mentioned Zoom was a big thing, obviously, during COVID to connect people, to provide that psychological, mental, and emotional support. What other ways can we harness technology, especially not just in developed countries, but even in developing countries where this is needed even more?
Yeah, I think one of the number one things that I think of would be, and I've talked a little bit about advocacy, but I think that there are very interesting things happening in patient education using technology. So we've kind of seen this around the world, but any way that we can integrate a patient's family into their care to help with continuity of care into the home is going to be critical. And so we see sort of technology platforms that are meant to empower kind of like post-surgical care or empower a woman's ability to really understand the perinatal experience so that she can be a better advocate for herself. So I'm generally interested in the use of health education via technology. I think that that's a really, really interesting area. I think, what we've seen a lot, throughout COVID is really the use of telemedicine for people that cannot get to a hospital or cannot get to a clinic. But I would also say in general that I've seen both the beauty of technology, but the limits of technology in healthcare. And so I'm very bullish on digital health, but I am much more bullish on a hybrid model whereby we have digital health, but we also have in-person care. I think that things like what CVS is doing, for example, where they're turning some of their minute clinics or their health hubs into behavioral health facilities where people could access care in person, I think that that will continue to be critically important. I think that there are always going to be patients that require in-person care, of course, with some procedures, but then also require, the connection and the human touch of being in person with someone. So I think that digital can replace a lot of the administrative burden, but I do think that there's always going to be an important element of human care delivery and connection.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So before we open it up to questions, is there anything else you want to highlight to our community? Anything else, any other topic that we did not touch on that that would be helpful for our community to know?
I would just say that, go out and do what you can for your community. Like I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important that we take on this, this burden of improving the healthcare system for all. I think we are all going to be living much longer lives, than potentially people before us did, despite the fact that life expectancy actually is declining in the US because of some of these social determinants of health that we discussed. But I think in general, we are going to have really long careers. And so to the extent that you can have that day job, but then also do something else where you contribute directly to the communities that you live in on the side, I think that will always make your life well-rounded and meaningful.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for sharing all that. I actually have a quick question for you. I think that might be helpful for the audience. Is you have had an interesting background. You started off in finance, and now you have gone to school. You have transitioned completely into healthcare. What steps did you take to make this transition happen? At least from my side, I can say that when I started off in finance and now I'm in the startup world, that transition was actually a little bit difficult initially. You get very hold in finance, and it's hard to come out. what were kind of the tips that you used, and how did you kind of make this decision on taking the route that you have taken?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is for many years, I felt pretty misdirected in my career. So if you're someone that is feeling stuck right now, I've been there. Advice that I was given that I've always found really helpful is be aware and pay attention to the things that make you really mad. And so when I worked at Citibank, I was having some personal health struggles that were driving me insane. I wasn't getting the information I needed. I was being bounced from provider to provider. It was taking a year, 2 years to figure something out. And that just drove me insane. And so that was actually really the early days of my interest in how do we improve the patient experience so that other people don't experience this. So I would say listen to, what makes you mad, because that's usually indicative of what you're going to be kind of eternally passionate about. And then the second thing I would say is that I spent a lot of time talking to other people. And so when I was joking about making the playbook earlier and wanting to talk to anyone who's interested in making a career transition or building something, I want to do that because a lot of people spent time with me, giving me advice and mentoring me. And so I am so ready to pay it forward now. So I would say, cold reach out to people on LinkedIn. You would be amazed by how many people actually get back to you. But in general, seek out the counsel of people who have done it before.
Sounds great. Well, I think we don't have any more questions. So this was really, really nice to have you here, Maddie. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights on healthcare. To all of our attendees, thank you for joining us. If you have any more questions for Maddie, feel free to write us at newyork@impacthub.net and we will get back to you. And I will be more than happy to share Maddie's LinkedIn and blog, and we look forward to your podcast and everything coming up so that the community can get in touch with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Madeleine, and thank you, Impact Hub, for hosting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, and we hope to see everybody at the next session. Bye.